She whispered, "No one must know this, but the heart doesn't keep secrets, and neither do we." The evening air was crisp, a gentle breeze carrying the scent of freshly cut grass and a faint hint of rain as the charity gala buzzed with excitement. The grand ballroom of the historic hotel glowed under golden chandeliers, their light reflecting off polished marble floors. Guests mingled in their elegant attire, laughter and clinking glasses filling the room. Among them, the politician's wife stood apart, effortlessly commanding attention, yet without saying a word. At 42, she was poised, confident, and striking in a way that didn't demand admiration but instead commanded respect. Her dress, a deep emerald green, hugged her frame in a way that was graceful and refined, and though the fabric was simple, it seemed to highlight the quiet strength in her every move. She didn't need to shout for attention, it was as if the world paused whenever she entered a space, allowing her presence to settle into the room. The narrator, a young man of 25, hadn't come to the event expecting much beyond a night of obligatory mingling, a rare opportunity to make connections in his new career. He had little interest in the high-stakes political game that surrounded the people in this room, yet when his gaze fell upon her, he found it hard to look away. There was an elegance to her that no one else in the room seemed to match, a depth in her eyes that spoke of something unspoken, something far beyond her polished exterior. They crossed paths at the bar, where the young man, trying to make small talk, accidentally spilled his drink. Flustered, he apologized quickly, but she only smiled, a soft, knowing curve of her lips that made his heart skip a beat. "It's quite all right," she said, her voice smooth and measured, with an undertone of something deeper, more intimate. Her smile was like a gentle invitation, and though they both remained composed, the tension between them was palpable. She offered him a napkin to help with the spill, her fingers brushing against his when he reached for it. It was just a brief moment, but the warmth of her touch lingered in his mind long after. He couldn't explain it, but the way she stood there, so effortlessly in control, made him feel both vulnerable and safe at the same time. Her eyes, a shade of deep brown, met his, and for a moment, the room seemed to fade away. No words passed between them, but the silence was filled with something undeniable, something electric. He was aware of every detail, the smoothness of her skin, the subtle curve of her jawline, the way her hair cascaded in soft waves around her shoulders. She was older than him, by more than a decade, but there was an unspoken connection that neither of them could yet name. As they parted, she offered a final, fleeting smile, a silent promise, or perhaps a question. He was left standing there, his pulse racing, feeling as if something had shifted in that moment, even if neither of them acknowledged it aloud. The evening unfolded with the usual flow of wine, laughter, and polite conversation, but the young man found his attention repeatedly drifting back to her. The politician's wife moved gracefully through the crowd, her every gesture measured and deliberate, but there was a weariness in her eyes that no one else seemed to notice. She had mastered the art of being everywhere and nowhere at once. And yet, when their eyes met across the room, there was a flicker of recognition, something beyond the usual pleasantries of a social gathering. It wasn't long before the opportunity to speak to her alone presented itself. A lull in the evening's chatter, an unspoken invitation, and they found themselves standing together by the grand windows that overlooked the city. The room was quieter here, the music and conversations muffled, leaving only the sound of their breaths and the distant hum of the city. For a moment, neither spoke. The young man was acutely aware of the space between them, the way the dim light bathed her in a soft, golden glow, casting long shadows across her face. He couldn't help but notice the slight furrow in her brow, the faint lines around her eyes that seemed to tell a story of their own, of late nights, hard decisions, and a life lived in the public eye. "Beautiful view," he said, the words slipping out awkwardly, but she smiled, a small, knowing curve of her lips. "Yes," she replied, her voice like velvet, low and steady. "But it's hard to enjoy from up here, sometimes." Her gaze drifted out the window, focusing on nothing in particular. Everything looked so perfect from a distance. But up close, she trailed off, as if unsure whether to continue. He could feel her hesitation, and for a brief moment, he almost wished he hadn't asked. He wasn't here to pry into her personal struggles. Yet, he couldn't shake the sense that this was not the first time she'd voiced her weariness. "What's it like?" he asked, his voice softer now, less formal. "Living in the shadow of politics. Always under the microscope." Her eyes flickered to him, and for the first time, she seemed to look at him, not through him. "It's exhausting," she admitted, her tone almost a whisper. "You learn to smile, to play the part. But sometimes, the weight of it all, it catches up." She paused, a look of vulnerability flickering across her face before it was quickly masked by the same calm, controlled exterior. He was struck by the honesty in her words. She wasn't seeking sympathy, but for just a moment, she allowed herself to be human. The tension between them, though subtle, was palpable, an unspoken understanding, a shared sense of quiet longing. He felt the urge to reach out, to say something more, but the moment passed, and the space between them seemed to stretch again. Yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. She had shown him a side of herself that no one else had seen, and in that fleeting exchange, he realized that he was no longer just an observer, he was part of her story. And perhaps, for the first time, she was allowing someone into hers. The following days passed in a haze of fleeting interactions, each one more charged than the last. Their paths seemed to cross at the most unexpected moments, an accidental brush of hands during a crowded gala, a quiet exchange of words at a charity event. Each encounter felt like it was laden with meaning, yet neither of them dared to speak it aloud. The young man found himself constantly searching for signs, little moments of connection that spoke louder than the words exchanged. But as much as he longed to draw closer, he could feel the invisible barriers she had built around herself, barriers that weren't so easily breached. It was one evening, at a fundraising dinner, when everything changed. The event was nearing its end, and most of the guests were either preparing to leave or gathered in small clusters, deep in conversation. The young man, feeling the weight of the night settle in, stepped outside for a breath of fresh air. The cool breeze felt like a balm against the oppressive tension inside, and he leaned against the balcony railing, the city skyline stretched before him. And then, there she was. Standing just a few feet away, her silhouette outlined against the lights of the city, her eyes distant as if lost in thought. She hadn't seen him yet, but he couldn't take his eyes off her, how the wind gently tugged at her hair, how the soft glow from the distant lights illuminated the quiet strength in her posture. He felt a sudden urge to go to her, to close the space between them, but something held him back. She turned, her eyes locking with his. There was no surprise, no discomfort in her gaze, just a quiet recognition. She stepped closer, the sound of her heels on the pavement the only thing breaking the stillness. "You've been avoiding me," she said, her voice tinged with a quiet vulnerability, the kind of softness that caught him off guard. It wasn't an accusation, but an observation, as if she knew exactly how he was feeling. He looked at her, not sure how to respond. He hadn't been avoiding her on purpose, but perhaps he had. He had sensed the distance she maintained, the walls she had carefully built. And yet, every time their eyes met, those walls seemed to crumble, if only for a moment. "I'm not avoiding you," he finally said, though the words sounded weak even to him. "I'm just trying to understand what this is." Her gaze softened for a fraction of a second, but then she pulled back, taking a step away from him. The space between them felt larger now, as if she was trying to distance herself from something she couldn't quite define. "You shouldn't," she said quietly, almost to herself. "You don't understand what you're stepping into." Her voice dropped lower, and the vulnerability that had once been there was replaced by an emotion he couldn't quite place. Was it fear? Regret? Before he could respond, she turned and walked away, her steps purposeful but slower than usual, as though she was reluctant to leave him standing there, but she couldn't stay. The moment had passed, and the silence that followed felt heavier than it ever had before. He was left standing in the shadows, her words echoing in his mind. "You don't understand what you're stepping into." What was it that she wasn't saying? What was she afraid of? He didn't know, but in that moment, he realized that their connection wasn't just about attraction, it was about something much deeper, something more complicated. And it was clear now that whatever it was, they were both scared to face it. The pull between them was undeniable, but so was the reality of the life she led, a life that was far more tangled and complicated than he could have imagined. And in that moment, he understood the true cost of this attraction. It was more than just the age gap between them. It was the weight of her world, the consequences that would come with breaking down those walls. And yet, as much as he wanted to turn away, he couldn't. As the days went on, the unspoken connection between them only grew stronger, like an invisible thread pulling them closer, even though neither dared to reach out. The young man found himself constantly seeking her out, his mind wandering back to their last conversation. The distance between them, though physically small at times, felt like an enormous chasm, one that neither of them seemed ready to cross. She remained an enigma, slipping in and out of his life like a fleeting dream, always present but never fully tangible. At work events, in the brief moments when they found themselves in the same room, there was an electric charge that neither could ignore. The air between them hummed with something more, but neither dared to name it. There were no overt gestures, no words spoken that could shift the balance of their carefully constructed facades. It was the little things, the moments that felt fleeting but lingered long after the fact, the way her gaze would linger on him for just a moment too long, the way her voice softened when she spoke to him, as though she had forgotten the world around them for an instant. One afternoon, they found themselves in the same art gallery, surrounded by the hushed murmur of patrons admiring the paintings. The young man had been drawn to the space, a quiet refuge from the bustling world, and there she was again, standing alone in front of a large portrait. Her expression was unreadable, her fingers lightly brushing the frame, a small gesture that seemed so intimate, as though she was connecting with something deeper in herself. He approached her slowly, unsure of what to say. The tension between them had grown since their last conversation, and now it felt almost unbearable. She didn't notice him at first, lost in the painting, but when she did, her eyes met his with an intensity that startled him. "Do you ever wonder," she started, her voice barely a whisper, "if we're meant to live a life of our own, or if we're just playing a part in someone else's story?" Her question took him off guard. He hadn't expected something so vulnerable, so raw. He thought of the life he was building for himself, how it seemed so different from hers, so free of the constraints that her world demanded. And yet, when he looked at her, he saw the quiet battle in her eyes, how her world was both her strength and her cage. The silence stretched between them, and in that moment, everything felt suspended. There were no grand declarations, no sweeping gestures. Just a moment, a shared understanding that neither could ignore. The world around them continued on as if nothing had changed, but everything between them had. She broke the silence with a soft, almost imperceptible sigh, turning her gaze back to the painting. "I don't know how to live in between worlds," she whispered, her voice tinged with something heavy, regret, longing, maybe even fear. The young man didn't respond immediately. He didn't know what to say. But one thing was clear, this was no longer just about attraction or curiosity. This was about two people caught in a web of circumstance, each struggling to find a way to navigate their own desires in a world that demanded their attention elsewhere. He could feel it in every moment they shared, the pull was undeniable, but so was the risk of giving into it. And as much as he wanted to push through that tension, he knew that neither of them was ready to take the leap just yet. It was late one evening, after the gala had ended, when the young man received a message from her. The message was simple, just an invitation to meet in a quiet cafe away from the public eye, away from the chaos of their lives. The politician's wife, in her world of speeches, dinners, and photo ops, had always seemed untouchable, as if her life was scripted for her. But tonight, the message was different, more personal, more real. It felt like a crack in her polished exterior, one that invited him into her world, not as an admirer from afar, but as someone who could understand the weight she carried. He arrived early, his heart pounding with anticipation. The cafe was empty, save for a few late-night patrons seated by the windows. The soft hum of the espresso machine was the only noise, its rhythmic sound almost comforting in the silence. He ordered a coffee and waited, trying to steady his nerves, but his mind kept returning to her poised confidence, her soft smile, the way she made everything else fade away when she was near. And then, she walked in. She looked just as he remembered, calm, collected, but with something else hidden in the depths of her eyes. The faintest trace of vulnerability. She wasn't wearing her usual tailored dress or heels, but something more comfortable, more subdued. A simple blouse and trousers, yet she still carried herself with grace, with an elegance that seemed almost effortless. She sat across from him, the space between them wide but not uncomfortable. Her gaze was steady, her hands folded in front of her as she watched him. It wasn't the usual polite smile she wore in public, this was different, more genuine, more uncertain. "I wasn't sure if I should ask you to meet me," she began, her voice soft but clear. "I don't know what's happening between us, but I can't keep pretending that I don't feel it. This connection. I never wanted to be in this situation, but I can't ignore it anymore." Her words were careful, deliberate, as if weighing each one for its impact. The young man sat there, stunned, his heart racing. He had sensed it, of course, the way they always gravitated toward each other, the quiet moments of understanding. But hearing her say it out loud felt like a sudden release, a weight lifted, and yet it brought with it a sense of responsibility. He leaned forward slightly, his voice low. "You don't have to explain. I feel it too. It's been building ever since I first met you. But I'm not sure what happens next. You're in a world that I don't fully understand, and I don't want to complicate your life any more than it already is." Her gaze softened, and for a moment, he saw something raw in her eyes. A mix of fear and something else, perhaps hope. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do either," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "But every time we talk, every time you're near, it feels like I'm finding a part of myself that's been missing. And that scares me." The silence that followed was thick with unspoken emotions. They were both at a crossroads, caught between the lives they had built and the possibility of something more. There was a heaviness in the air, but it wasn't a burden, it was the weight of truth, of finally acknowledging the bond between them. "I'm scared too," he confessed, his words barely a whisper. "Scared of what happens if we cross this line. But I can't deny that I want to." The young man and the politician's wife sat there for a long while, the silence between them no longer awkward but filled with understanding. There were no more words needed, just the quiet promise that they had crossed into uncharted territory together. Whatever happened next, they both knew one thing: this moment would change everything. In the days that followed their conversation, the young man found himself in a whirlwind of confusion and desire. They had spoken their truths, admitted the unspoken connection between them, but now the reality of what that meant started to settle in. The space between them, once a soft tension that could be ignored, was now undeniable, filling every room they were in, every conversation they shared. Yet, despite the unspoken promise that lingered, neither of them had acted on it. The politician's wife, in particular, seemed to retreat into herself. She went back to her usual routine, her role as the politician's partner, her carefully crafted image in the public eye, the smile that never wavered. He saw her at various events, always the picture of grace and poise, but there was a distinct distance in her eyes, an unspoken sadness that no one else seemed to notice. She had taken a step back, retreating behind the walls she had so carefully built over the years. He, too, struggled. He couldn't deny what he felt for her, but he understood the gravity of the situation. She was not just any woman, she was the wife of one of the most influential politicians in the country. Their worlds were incompatible, their lives separated by more than just age or experience. There were public expectations, reputations to maintain, and consequences neither of them were ready to face. He wondered if she would ever be able to truly step out from that shadow, or if she would always be bound by the weight of her position. One afternoon, they found themselves alone again, away from the public eye, in the quiet of her office. The weight of their silence was almost suffocating. They had both been avoiding the conversation, the conversation that would inevitably change everything, but the tension had reached its peak. She sat behind her desk, papers scattered before her, though her attention was clearly not on them. He stood by the window, looking out at the view of the city, his mind racing. "I can't keep doing this," she said quietly, her voice trembling slightly. "I can't keep pretending that this isn't real. That you're not real." He turned to face her, his heart pounding in his chest. "I feel the same way. But this, whatever this is, it's not just about us. It's about everything. The world we live in, the lives we've built. We can't just ignore the consequences." Her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed the papers in front of her, her eyes avoiding his. "I've spent my entire life being the perfect wife, the perfect partner. I've built this image, this life that people admire and respect. But I don't know how much longer I can keep doing it, not when part of me is here, with you." Her words were barely a whisper, and he could see the struggle in her eyes. He took a step toward her, the distance between them narrowing once again. "I don't want to take that away from you. But I can't deny that what we have is real. I don't know what happens next, but I know we can't ignore this anymore." She looked up at him, her gaze soft yet conflicted. "I don't know how to live in this in-between. To be someone who doesn't fit in the world I've built, but to also know that there's something else waiting for me." The young man moved closer, now standing just a few feet from her. He reached out, placing his hand gently on the desk between them, a small gesture but one that spoke volumes. She looked down at his hand, her breath catching, before she reached out to touch it, her fingers brushing against his. For a moment, the world outside ceased to exist. The noise, the pressure, the expectations, they were all gone. It was just the two of them, caught in the same moment, uncertain but fully aware of the pull between them. "I'm not asking you to make a decision now," he said softly. "I'm just asking for a chance. A chance to see what we can be, without the fear of everything else." Her fingers lingered on his for a heartbeat longer before she pulled away. She didn't speak for a long moment, and when she did, her voice was barely a whisper. "I don't know if I'm ready for that," she admitted. "But I think I need to see what happens next." The weight of her words settled between them, heavy with promise but also uncertainty. There were no guarantees, no answers. But in that moment, both of them understood that they were standing on the edge of something that could change their lives forever. And neither of them was quite ready to step back. The following days felt like an unraveling of everything they had known, as if they were both standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting for the right moment to leap. The young man found himself caught between hope and hesitation, knowing that what they had shared could not remain in the shadows for much longer. The politician's wife, too, seemed to be in a state of quiet turmoil. She returned to her public life, but there was a change in her, a softness that had not been there before, a vulnerability that she couldn't hide, even behind her practiced smile. It was clear now that they could no longer continue as they had. The silence between them, the lingering glances, the moments that had once felt like a thrilling game, had now become a weight too heavy to bear. Neither of them could ignore the depth of their feelings, nor the quiet understanding that whatever path they chose, it would not be easy. It was in the stillness of a rainy afternoon that they found themselves alone again, this time in the quiet of her private garden, the gentle patter of the rain creating a peaceful backdrop. The air smelled fresh, the scent of damp earth mingling with the soft fragrance of roses. She stood by the wrought iron gate, looking out at the garden, her back to him as if lost in thought. He approached cautiously, unsure of how to break the silence that had stretched so long between them. But when she turned to face him, her eyes were open and steady, no longer clouded by uncertainty. There was a quiet resolve in her gaze that gave him a sense of calm. She had made her decision, even if the weight of it was still heavy on her shoulders. "I can't keep living in two worlds," she said softly, her voice barely above the sound of the rain. "I've spent my life building a facade, playing a role that isn't truly mine. But I can't ignore the truth anymore. And I can't keep pretending that I don't want something more, something real." Her words were simple, but the emotion behind them was undeniable. The young man stood still for a moment, his heart racing as he processed her words. It was what he had hoped for, what he had feared, but now that it was finally out in the open, he found himself at a loss for what to say. This was the moment they had been waiting for, the point of no return. And yet, it felt like a quiet surrender rather than a victory. "I don't want to take you away from your life," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "But if you're ready to let go of the past and step into something new, I'm here. For you. Whatever that means." She stepped closer, her eyes searching his face for any trace of hesitation. But all she found was certainty. There was no need for grand gestures, no need for promises that they couldn't keep. They were both still unsure of what the future held, but in that moment, they knew they were ready to face it together. Her fingers brushed against his, and the touch was electric, not from passion, but from the quiet understanding that had finally settled between them. She didn't need to say anything else. The connection between them had already spoken volumes. It was time to let go of the past and step forward into the unknown, together. And as the rain continued to fall around them, the world outside seemed to quiet, leaving only the two of them standing in the stillness, their hearts in sync, ready to face whatever came next. No more masks, no more pretenses, just two people, bound by something deeper than either of them had ever imagined. The beginning of something real.